Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic a little less philosophical and a lot more greasy. Medieval junk food. Yes, even in a world without fast food chains, vending machines, or hot dog carts, people still found ways to snack. And let me tell you, some of it was delicious. Some of it was disturbing. All of it was deeply medieval. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In a world where most snacks looked suspicious and tasted worse, apple fritters were a rare win. Sweet, hot, and slightly dangerous, just like every good medieval decision. These golden little pucks were the closest thing to a medieval donut, minus the frosting and food safety standards. So what exactly went into a fritter back then? Apples, obviously, but not the shiny, polished supermarket kind. Think small, tart, knobbly things that grew behind the alehouse and may or may not have been stolen from a neighbor's tree. They were chopped up, tossed in a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because water was always a gamble, and ale made everything feel slightly more cheerful. Then came the fry. Deep frying in the 1300s was a special kind of drama. The oil, usually pig fat, was reused until it could probably vote. It added flavor, which is a generous word for it, but the result was something hot, crispy, and oddly addictive. A fritter fresh out of the pan was a little piece of joy. Crispy edges, soft center, and a faint risk of third-degree burns. If you were lucky and rich, it might be dusted with imported sugar, a luxury that doubled as a social flex. For everyone else, a drizzle of honey or spiced syrup did the trick. Either way, it was sweet enough to distract you from the rest of your diet, which mostly involved cabbage pretending to be other things. Fritters were street food. You'd grab one at a fair, after church, or on market days when you needed a treat, and didn't mind grease on your tunic. Kids loved them. Adults loved them. Birds tried to steal them. They were fun, fast, and just indulgent enough to make you forget about the pickled turnips waiting at home. And yes, sometimes they were overcooked, or the apples were more sour than sweet, or the batter was suspiciously chewy. But when they were good, they were really good. One bite in and suddenly you understood why people put up with medieval life. If apple fritters were the medieval version of a donut, then cheese curds were, well, sort of the medieval popcorn. Bite-sized, slightly squeaky, and wildly inconsistent. They weren't flashy. They didn't melt. They didn't stretch. In fact, they barely did anything at all. And that's what made them perfect. Let's be clear, medieval cheese wasn't aiming for Instagram glory. It was made fast, eaten faster, and expected to survive long journeys, questionable storage, and the occasional goat stepping on it. Cheese curds were essentially baby cheese, the early fresh bits before the wheel hardened into something that could double as a building material. These little clumps of dairy joy were a byproduct of the cheese-making process. Farmers would separate milk into curds and whey using rennet, which sounds fancy until you realize it came from the stomach lining of a baby animal. But hey, it worked. The curds were pressed, lightly salted, and then, that was it. Cheese curds. Sometimes they were soft, sometimes rubbery, sometimes they squeaked on your teeth like they had a personality. But they were filling, portable, and weirdly satisfying. And in a time where snack usually meant old bread or cold broth, curds felt like a win. Monks loved them. Travelers packed them. Kids would eat them like candy, assuming the cows had been cooperative that week. You could fry them, crumble them over stews, or just eat them by the handful while pretending not to smell like the inside of a barn. Unlike many medieval foods, cheese curds didn't require a celebration or feast. They weren't saved for holidays or saints' days. They were just there. Comforting, familiar, mildly chewy. The friend who always shows up, never overperforms, but is weirdly reliable when everything else falls apart. Did they sometimes taste a little off? Sure, freshness was a spectrum in the Middle Ages. But with enough salt and enthusiasm, most people didn't complain. Besides, in a world without refrigeration, your standards naturally adjust. So no, cheese curds weren't glamorous. But they were simple, hearty, and just indulgent enough to count as a treat. In a pinch, they were also excellent for bribing cats and small children. Turnips are not dessert. Let's just start there. But in the medieval world, where sugar was expensive, apples weren't always in season, and creative desperation was a major food group. Someone, somewhere, looked at a turnip and thought, what if this were a pie? And so, the turnip pie was born. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always awful. Sometimes it was even kind of good. Think mashed turnips, hopefully tender, blended with a bit of egg, maybe some honey or dried fruit if the cook was feeling generous. Then baked inside a sturdy crust made of flour, water, and ambition. The result? Surprisingly edible. At best, it was warm, a little sweet, and had that vaguely comforting root vegetable meats pudding vibe. At worst, it tasted like someone had mistaken livestock feed for a baking ingredient and just rolled with it. Turnip pies were popular for two main reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could hide a multitude of sins. Whether the turnips were overripe, undercooked, or suspiciously bitter, once you baked them into a pie and added a drizzle of honey, it became peasant cuisine with aspirations. Was it cheesecake? No. But it tried, and in medieval Europe, trying counted for a lot. You'd find these pies at fairs, feast tables, and in particularly enthusiastic monasteries where the monks had a little too much time and a lot of extra root vegetables. Some recipes added spices, nutmeg if the abbey was rich, pepper if the cook was chaotic. Occasionally, raisins made an appearance, which only confused people further. Nobles didn't eat turnip pie unless they were slumming it for fun or pretending to relate to the common folk for political reasons. But for everyone else, it was dessert. Sort of. More like an afterthought with pastry. And yet, despite its questionable logic, the turnip pie endured. People liked it. Or at least, they didn't dislike it enough to stop making it. It was cheap, filling, and mildly sweet, which for medieval food made it basically revolutionary. If the medieval world had a comfort food MVP, it was the meat pasty, a handheld pie stuffed with seasoned meat, tucked into a folded crust, and baked until it was golden brown or slightly scorched. Basically a medieval hot pocket, minus the microwave, and plus a genuine sense of danger. The beauty of the pasty was its portability. You could eat it on the road, in the fields, or while watching a public execution, whatever the day demanded. Wrapped in a thick pastry crust, it stayed warm for a while and protected the contents from dirt, rats, and the occasional peasant sneeze. But let's talk about that filling. Meat, in this case, was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or a hunting estate, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. Actual recognizable meat. If not, well, options expanded dramatically. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Anything that once had legs, or slithered, could be diced, seasoned, and hidden inside pastry with plausible deniability. Spices were often used to enhance flavor, or, more realistically, to distract you from it. Pepper, sage, and garlic helped, but they couldn't completely hide the fact that the meat had been resting for a few days longer than it should have. Still, in a time when refrigeration was a fantasy and lunch was often just bread and onions, a meaty pasty felt indulgent. There were even vegetarian versions, filled with root vegetables, leeks, or cheese, for fasting days or the particularly devout. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the crowd pleasers. They were greasy, hot, and comforting. You didn't ask what was inside. You just ate it and hoped the cook had been in a good mood. And in case you're wondering, yes, People sometimes marked the crust with initials or symbols to claim ownership, especially among miners and laborers. In some places, the crust was extra thick along one edge, so it could be held with dirty hands and then tossed to the spirits or, more realistically, to rats. So were they good? Often yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was part of the charm. You didn't eat a meat pasty to feel safe. You ate it because it tasted good, and you were ready to accept the consequences. In a world where brushing your teeth meant rinsing with wine and hoping for the best, candied fennel seeds were the closest thing medieval folks had to breath mints. Tiny, sugary, and vaguely herbal, they were part treat, part digestive aid, and part dental hazard, all wrapped up in a single, oddly satisfying crunch. These little seeds were typically coated in a hard shell of sugar, which was no small feat in the Middle Ages. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and poured by hand, meaning someone, somewhere, really believed in the potential of these tiny snacks. They were especially popular in noble households, where guests might be handed a small dish of them after dinner to freshen the mouth, and probably to distract from the mutton still clinging to their molars. Flavor-wise, fennel seeds had a strong, licorice-like bite. You either loved them or politely swallowed them whole and nodded in gratitude. The sugar coating helped, but there was always that unmistakable herbal kick, the kind of thing that makes you feel both fancy and slightly confused. Candied seeds also had a job to do: digestion. People believed fennel helped settle the stomach, especially after a heavy meal involving 3 types of bird and an alarming amount of mead. Think of them as the medieval version of chewing gum crossed with Tums, but with more potential to chip a tooth. And yes, they were hard. Like, crack your molar if you're too confident, hard. You didn't chew candied fennel seeds casually. You tested one first, gently, bit down slowly, listened for cracking sounds, then committed. There was a risk-reward situation every time. While the rich popped them like medieval tic-tacs, common folk occasionally got their hands on knockoff versions, usually involving honey, crushed herbs, and vague optimism. Not quite the same, but good enough to pretend. In the grand lineup of medieval junk food, candied fennel seeds were small but mighty. They didn't fill your belly, but they left a pleasant taste in your mouth and gave the illusion of refinement, even if you were covered in mud and still had goose grease on your tunic. If medieval desserts had a golden child, it was the honey cake. Sweet, dense, and prone to sticking to everything except your expectations. Honey cakes were what happened when bakers got ambitious and sugar was still locked in a castle treasury. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming those people had bees, access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing trees and getting stung in the face. These cakes were usually made with flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey, or at least what passed for spoonfuls in an era where spoons were mostly used to fight off siblings. The result? A firm, chewy slab that could either be a delightful snack or a makeshift doorstop, depending on how long it had been sitting near the hearth. Spices were sometimes added if the household was feeling wealthy or showing off. Nutmeg, cloves, or cinnamon could give the honey cake a bit of flair, and by flair we mean the ability to cause an entire village to talk about your recipe for a week. Dried fruits were also tossed in if they hadn't been stolen by the local children or turned into wine. Honey cakes were popular at feasts, festivals, and weddings, mostly because they could be made ahead of time, didn't spoil quickly, and could survive being dropped on the ground, stepped on, or thrown at someone in a mild food fight. They were also used as gifts, bribes, and occasionally passive-aggressive statements. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike your personality. Structurally, they weren't what you'd call delicate. Many resembled compact bricks. Slicing them required a sturdy knife and the quiet hope that no one was watching you struggle. Eating them was easier. Just don't expect a fluffy bite. These cakes were built for medieval life. Tough, durable, and coated in enough sticky honey to make your hands feel like you lost a battle with a beehive. But they were satisfying. They tasted like warmth and indulgence, like the rare moment you weren't chewing salted barley or chasing rats out of your cupboard. They were joy, wrapped in sugar, with just enough chew to count as cardio. Fried fish skin cracklings, possibly the most unexpectedly delightful snack to emerge from a culture that also thought eel pie was a good idea. These crispy, salty little strips weren't glamorous, but they were efficient. Waste not, want not, especially when you're working with a fish that, frankly, smells like it's judging you. Let's be honest, no one set out to invent this. More likely, some thrifty cook was left staring at a pile of discarded fish skins and thought, what if we just fried it? A splash of hot fat later, and history was made. Or at least something vaguely edible was born. Fish skin was plentiful, especially in coastal towns, or near rivers where herring, cod, or whatever had been pulled out of the water was processed on site. The meat went to the stew pot, the heads went to the cat, and the skin, that got thrown into a pan of bubbling oil and sizzled into submission. The result was surprisingly addictive. A thin, crispy snack that crunched like a dried leaf, but tasted like concentrated ocean. A pinch of salt elevated the experience. A hint of garlic or herbs. Well now, you were flirting with culinary excellence. These cracklings weren't just tasty, they were practical. Lightweight, non-perishable-ish, and high in fat. Exactly what a medieval body craved after a day of hauling firewood or defending sheep from someone else's sheep. Soldiers packed them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside taverns for a few coins and the satisfaction of feeding drunk people something louder than their conversation. Did they sometimes still have scales? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into weird shapes that made you question your life choices? Also, yes. But by medieval standards, they were downright elegant, crispy, flavorful, and unlikely to give you dysentery. The only real drawback: smell. These things could announce their presence from 3 huts away. If you fried a batch indoors, your home would smell like Poseidon's laundry for a solid week. But you'd be forgiven, because they tasted good. When life gave you stale bread and warm beer, you didn't cry. You made the most medieval snack imaginable: bread soaked in ale. Known variously as sops or trench toast, this humble creation was the original comfort food. Think French toast, but without the eggs, sugar, cinnamon, or joy. Here's how it worked. You took yesterday's bread, the kind that could double as building material, and dunked it into a bowl of ale. Not fancy craft ale with notes of citrus and a hoppy finish. No, this was flat, low-alcohol medieval ale brewed in someone's smoky back room with the hygiene standards of a barn owl. The bread absorbed the ale like a sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed from a jawbreaker into something vaguely edible. Was it tasty? In the right light, with a good mood and low expectations? Yes, kind of. It was warm, bready, and carried the gentle bitterness of fermented grain, which is to say it didn't actively offend the palate. This snack was especially popular with the working class, people who didn't have time for multiple courses or cutlery, but still needed calories that wouldn't fight back. Bread soaked in ale was quick, hearty, and just messy enough to feel like a real break from your daily chores. Sometimes people added extras: a sprinkle of herbs, a bit of cheese, or a fried egg if the hen felt generous that morning. On feast days, you might even get sops soaked in spiced ale, which basically meant the cook found a nutmeg shaving somewhere and got inspired, and like many medieval dishes, this one had dual purpose. Not only was it food, it was also a way to stretch ingredients. Bread too stale to chew, just soak it. Ale starting to turn, pour it on bread and pretend it's intentional. Waste was for amateurs. The only downside: it didn't travel well. Once soaked, the bread turned into a kind of slushy porridge cube. Eat it quickly, or risk ending up with a mushy sponge in your bowl and a 1,000-year-old food metaphor for disappointment. Still, for a chilly evening by the fire, nothing beat a slice of ale bread mush and a moment of peace. If you've ever looked at a slice of bread and thought, this would be better submerged in alcohol, congratulations. You and the medieval upper class have something in common. Sops in wine were one of the more refined, red, bizarrely specific snacks of the Middle Ages. A dessert, technically, or perhaps an experience. The concept was simple. Take bread, ideally toasted or at least not completely stale, and dunk it in wine. Not just any wine, of course. Usually mulled, sweetened, or spiced wine. Something warm, fragrant, and barely hiding the fact that it had been sitting in a clay jug since last harvest. Once the bread was sufficiently drenched, it was served as a soft, spoonable delicacy. Nobles called it elegant. Everyone else quietly wondered if the cook had just run out of ideas. This was not finger food. It was the kind of dish you ate with a spoon very slowly, while pretending to be interested in lute music. It appeared at banquets, late-night feasts, and the kind of awkward dinner where no one wanted to talk about politics, so instead they passed around soggy toast in a goblet. When done well, sops in wine were warm, comforting, and mildly intoxicating, a gentle end to a heavy meal. The wine added richness, the bread gave texture, and the spices made you feel like you were part of something fancier than it was. When done poorly, it was wet bread in a bowl. No amount of cinnamon could cover up the feeling that you were chewing on a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added for flair, sometimes cheese, occasionally a whole egg. At that point, it stopped being a snack and became a culinary guessing game. Peasants made their own versions, usually using cheap vinegar or ale instead of wine. It wasn't dessert. It was dinner. Or breakfast. Or whatever you could call a meal that made you both full and confused. Still, sops in wine had staying power. They were warm. They were filling. And they gave medieval people a taste of indulgence, even if it did taste like sponge soaked in mulled regret. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was a prized treat, sugary, exotic, and shelf-stable enough to survive an entire crusade. But let's be clear, this wasn't your modern trail mix with cute, resealable packaging. Medieval dried fruit had one job: to last. Taste was optional. Texture, aggressively chewy. Dental damage, practically a guarantee. Let's start with the basics. You had your usual suspects: raisins, figs, dates, and if you were really fancy, imported prunes. These were fruits that had been sun-dried, smoke-dried, or in some cases, just forgotten on a windowsill until they no longer qualified as moist. They were wrinkled, tough, and alarmingly dense. Kind of like an edible time capsule from last harvest. The upside: dried fruit was sweet. Really sweet. Concentrated sugars turned these shriveled little things into medieval candy. Nobles loved them, monks hoarded them, and children treated them like rare loot from the kitchen. The downside: chewing them was like fighting your own jaw muscles. Figs came with seeds that doubled as medieval dental floss. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars together. Raisins stuck in your teeth for hours. There was no such thing as snacking quietly. Still, dried fruit had its moments. It was used in pies, added to porridge, or chopped up and thrown into honey cakes to create the illusion of variety. Rich folks might wrap them in pastry, drizzle them with rose water, or soak them in wine like they were trying to impress a guest from Florence. For commoners, getting your hands on dried fruit was a special occasion, usually a holiday, a wedding, or the one day a year someone remembered you existed. When that happened, you'd eat it slowly, respectfully, possibly while hiding in the barn so you didn't have to share. Storage was easy. Dried fruit didn't spoil quickly and was often kept in little cloth sacks or clay pots. It hardened over time, yes, but that just turned it into a longer-lasting snack, or possibly a projectile if you were creative and had younger siblings. In short, dried fruit was sweet, luxurious, and faintly dangerous. It stuck with you, sometimes literally. You wake up hungry. You want something hearty, something fried, something that might bite back. Enter the blood pudding bowl. A medieval snack so dense, so bold, so unapologetically iron-rich, it makes modern sausage rolls look like timid breadsticks. Born out of the noble tradition of using every part of the animal, these savory spheres were proof that waste not, want not, even if what you're not wasting is blood. Let's unpack it. First, you collect fresh animal blood, usually pig, though honestly any blood would do in a pinch. You then mix it with oats, onions, suet, that's beef fat, and spices. Once that morbid porridge reaches just the right level of grim stickiness, you shape it into bowls and fry them in sizzling fat until the outside crisps up like it has something to prove. The result? Dark, crispy orbs of protein-packed sustenance with a rich, earthy flavor, which is code for, you'll taste iron and mystery for the rest of the day. They were best served hot, fresh from the skillet, though sometimes they were eaten cold if your appetite outweighed your fear of congealed fat. Nobles might dress them up with pepper, or serve them with eggs and ale. Peasants, they were just happy not to be chewing on boiled cabbage again. Blood pudding bowls weren't elegant, but they were practical, easy to carry, high in calories, and alarmingly filling. If you ate 2, you could skip lunch. If you ate 4, you were probably a blacksmith or trying to win a dare. These snacks were common at fairs, markets, and roadside stalls where everything smelled like livestock and ambition. They were especially popular in colder months, because what warms the soul like fried coagulation? Of course, blood pudding bowls weren't for everyone. Some folks didn't love the texture. Others didn't love the concept. But in a world where survival came first and flavor came somewhere around 12th, these meaty little morsels earned their place in the medieval junk food hall of fame. Forget everything you know about pancakes. These weren't fluffy stacks with maple syrup and whipped cream. Medieval pancakes were thinner, tougher, and cooked in enough lard to make your arteries consider early retirement. But they got the job done. And in a world where your other breakfast option was thin soup that soured about its life, they were kind of a treat. Made from a humble mix of flour, eggs, and water or ale, these pancakes were poured onto a sizzling iron griddle coated in bubbling pig fat. No non-stick pans, no portion control. You just ladled and hoped. The result? A flat, uneven circle with crispy, browned edges and a slightly chewy center. The kind of pancake that could survive a horseback ride and still be mostly edible when you arrived. Sometimes it was a little burnt. Sometimes it was a little raw. Sometimes charmingly. Both. Flavor depended on what you had. A splash of ale added a nice tang. A spoonful of honey. Luxurious. A sprinkle of herbs or onions. Adventurous. But most of the time it was just pancake and grease, served hot and inhaled like you just run from a tax collector. These pancakes were democratic. Everyone ate them. Peasants, nobles, monks, merchants. Some layered them with cheese, some dunked them in broth, and others just rolled them up and called it a day. You could eat them sweet, savory, or scorched beyond recognition. And if you had leftovers, stack them up and pretend they were cake or armor. They were especially popular during Lent and other fasting days when meat was off limits. Pancakes became a loophole, fried, filling, and somehow both humble and indulgent. Plus, they made excellent vessels for disguising other ingredients that had no business being in your mouth. And while they might not have been beautiful, medieval pancakes had staying power. They didn't need praise, they just needed a hot pan and a willing stomach. Somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, we find the medieval wafer. A thin, crisp, suspiciously light biscuit that danced the line between dessert and dental challenge. Wafers were everywhere, outside churches, at village fairs, in the hands of monks, and occasionally floating in your soup like a flat, holy crouton. Let's clarify. We're not talking about chocolate-dipped, cream-filled delights. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If you were feeling fancy, you could add a dash of honey or rose water, but most stuck with the basics. Thin batter poured onto hot metal wafer irons, pressed between two scorching plates, like a medieval panini press. The result? Something that looked like it belonged in a communion ceremony, and tasted like crispy paper with ambitions. Wafers were popular because they were portable, fast to make, and, best of all, they could be sold in massive quantities for a tidy profit. Vendors would set up outside churches on feast days, waving stacks of warm wafers at the faithful as they left Mass. "Buy now, sin later" was not the slogan, but it was the general vibe. They were often shaped with religious symbols, floral patterns, or the vague imprint of a saint's face, depending on the iron mold and how tired the baker was. These designs didn't enhance the flavor, but they did give you something to stare at, while chewing thoughtfully and pretending you weren't disappointed. Structurally, wafers were delicate. They cracked if you looked at them wrong, and shattered if you tried to break them cleanly. Storing them was a challenge, transporting them even more so, which made eating them outdoors a high-stakes affair involving crumbs, wind, and regret. Still, they were beloved. Light, crispy, and vaguely celebratory, wafers were the medieval version of treating yourself without completely wrecking your digestion or your wallet. For nobles, they came stacked with fruit or layered with soft cheese. For everyone else, they were sold by the dozen in street stalls and eaten immediately before they disintegrated into edible confetti. Suck it. Even the name sounds sticky. This medieval treat was essentially fruit that had been boiled into submission, drowned in syrup, and sealed in a jar like a sweet little hostage. Think candied oranges, dates, or ginger, coated in enough sugar to make your teeth tingle and your conscience whisper, "You shouldn't be eating this." But you did, because it was delicious, and probably imported, and also you didn't have much else. Sucket wasn't for the everyday peasant chewing his 7th onion of the week. No, this was elite-tier snacking, the kind of indulgence served in noble halls or gifted by the wealthy to say, "I like you but not enough to give you land." Sugar was expensive and fruits weren't always in season, so sucket was reserved for special occasions, like weddings, or royal visits, or Wednesday, if you were outrageously rich and out of control. The preparation process was ambitious. First, you'd boil the fruit in syrup. Maybe honey, maybe refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you a favor. Then you'd drain it, let it dry a bit, and repeat. Several times. Because once wasn't enough. You weren't just preserving fruit, you were declaring war on moisture itself. Eventually, the result was a glossy, jewel-toned bite of candy, chewy, intense, and so sweet it could probably be weaponized in large enough doses. Some versions were soft and syrupy, served in ornate glass jars. Others were dry, rolled in extra sugar, and handed out as dainty little cubes of medieval hyperglycemia. But make no mistake, sucket came with status. It said you had access to sugar, trade routes, and at least one servant dedicated solely to stirring things that didn't want to be stirred. Sucket trays were passed around after banquets like edible gold coins. Guests took one piece, smiled graciously, and immediately regretted not grabbing 3. As for commoners, they watched from the kitchen and maybe licked a spoon if no one was looking. So was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Sucket was one of the few medieval snacks that genuinely felt like dessert. It was rich, refined, and just extravagant enough to make up for the fact that dinner had included boiled something. Fried eel, the grand finale of medieval junk food. A dish so strangely beloved, it made its way from peasant hearths to royal banquets without once stopping to ask, "Wait, am I really the best option here?" Yes. Yes, it was. Eel was everywhere in medieval Europe. Rivers and streams practically writhed with them, and they were easy to catch, cheap to cook, and, when fried, surprisingly crispy. Slippery when raw, bonier than expected, and shaped like the villain in a fish-themed horror story, eel was still eaten by the bucket load. Why? Because it was tasty. And more importantly, it wasn't turnips. To prepare it, you'd first have to catch the eel, usually at night, when they slithered through shallow waters like sentient noodles. Then came the unpleasant task of skinning them, which was less like prepping a fish and more like wrestling a wet rope that didn't want to die. Once subdued, the eels were chopped, seasoned, if you were feeling bold, and tossed into hot fat until the skin crisped up and the meat firmed into something vaguely appealing. The finished product, a crunchy, savory bite with a rich, slightly oily flavor, like if calamari and chicken had an identity crisis in a tavern kitchen. Fried eel was served at fairs, feasts, roadside inns, and believe it or not, during religious fasts. That's right. Eel wasn't technically meat, so it slipped through the dietary loopholes like itself. Monks ate it. Nobles flaunted it. Kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across banquets like the sea serpent it always wanted to be. Sure, it had bones. Lots of them. And yes, it occasionally wriggled long after death. But if you could get past that, and the haunting feeling that you were eating a villain from a cautionary folktale, fried eel was genuinely delicious. Crispy skin, tender inside, and just greasy enough to make you feel like you were living a little too dangerously for a Wednesday afternoon. Today, it might seem bizarre. Back then, it was a delicacy. A slippery little miracle that kept bellies full and menus weird. In the ancient world, Mesopotamia stood at the crossroads of mystery and mythology, and nowhere was this more evident than in how they viewed dreams. To the Sumerians, Akkadians, Assyrians, and Babylonians, a dream wasn't just a private, meaningless experience. It was a divine telegram, a supernatural email sent directly from the gods to the subconscious, and ignoring it. That was like leaving a message from Enlil unread. Dangerous. By around 2500 BCE, Mesopotamians had developed a full-blown system of dream interpretation, recorded on clay tablets in cuneiform script. These weren't bedtime novelties. They were used in statecraft, medicine, and religious rituals. Kings would delay wars if a troubling dream suggested bad omens. Farmers wouldn't plant crops if they saw a goat fly across the sky in their sleep. The world, they believed, was constantly speaking. It was your job to listen with your eyes closed. Professional dream interpreters, called Baru priests, were the ancient equivalent of Freudian analysts, minus the couch. They were trained in libraries of omen texts, like the Ishkar Zakuk, an elaborate dream manual that categorized dreams and their meanings in sometimes absurd but eerily precise ways. Dreaming of eating dates, good omen. Dreaming of your teeth falling out, expect death in the family. Dreaming of sex with a goddess, well, congrats. You're either divinely favored or cursed with arrogance. These dream books didn't claim to guess meanings. They presented cause and effect as if dreams were equations. A equals B. See a snake? Expect betrayal. Fall from a rooftop? A lawsuit is coming. The world of dreams was logical, just operating on divine logic, which was far stranger than human reason. But the Mesopotamians didn't stop at interpretation. They practiced dream incubation too. If a ruler wanted guidance from the gods, he might sleep in a temple under special circumstances, fasting, cleansing rituals, perhaps a few incense offerings, and wait for a revelatory dream. The idea was that certain environments made the divine connection stronger, clearer, and less prone to nightmares about drunk goats. For Mesopotamians, the dream world was not a mystery to solve. It was a realm to navigate with caution, reverence, and a very large clay tablet library. They believed the gods were always speaking. You just had to be asleep to hear them. In ancient Egypt, dreams weren't merely nightly occurrences. They were considered sacred texts in motion. The Egyptians believed that dreams were messages from the gods, ancestors, or even from one's own K, the spiritual double of a person. Every dream, good or bad, came with intent. It could warn, bless, instruct, or terrify. By the time of the New Kingdom, circa 1550-1070 BCE, the Egyptians had begun recording their interpretations in what would become some of history's earliest dream manuals. One of the most famous examples is the Ramesside Dream Book, written on papyrus and discovered in the village of Deir el-Medina. This wasn't light reading. It's essentially a divine diagnostic tool, listing hundreds of dreams and interpreting each based on whether the outcome would be favorable or disastrous. The logic, however, was not always intuitive. For example, if a man sees himself eating crocodile flesh in a dream, it means he will become a high official. Strange, yes. But in Egyptian cosmology, the crocodile was tied to the god Sobek, who embodied strength and power. Eating crocodile meant absorbing divine traits. That's a promotion-worthy omen. Each entry in the dream book started with the phrase, "if a man sees himself," followed by a symbolic scenario. These weren't general guesses. They were drawn from centuries of ritual knowledge, personal visions, and temple tradition. And the interpretations were often binary, marked as good or bad in red and black ink. If your dream was classified as bad, it was time to light some incense and beg a priest to intervene. Priests in temple complexes, especially those serving healing deities like Serket or Thoth, sometimes offered services in dream incubation, where supplicants would sleep in the temple and await guidance or healing through visions. The idea was to open a divine channel through purification, prayer, and controlled sleep. This wasn't mere superstition. It was healthcare, divination, and theology rolled into one night's rest. Dreams also influenced magic and medicine. Amulets might be prescribed to fend off recurring nightmares. Specific rituals could be performed to erase a dream, much like you'd erase a curse. For the ancient Egyptians, the sleeping mind was not idle. It was a stage where gods, demons, and the spirits of the dead could appear and offer glimpses into hidden truths, if you had the wisdom and a priest to decode them. In the ancient Greek world, dreams were more than divine whispers. They were clinical appointments with the gods. Central to this belief was the practice of incubation, a ritual where individuals would sleep inside a temple in hopes of receiving a healing vision. And no deity was more closely tied to this practice than Asclepius, the god of medicine. At temples known as Asclepia, which dotted the Greek world from Epidaurus to Pergamon, the sick, the hopeful, and the desperate came seeking cures. But instead of pills or potions, they were prescribed sleep, sacred, intentional, and performed under specific spiritual conditions. Before entering the temple's sleeping quarters, or abaton, a person would undergo purification, bathing, fasting, and sometimes sacrificing an animal. Only after these rituals could they lay down on a stone bed and wait for the god to appear in a dream. The results? According to inscriptions and ancient testimonies, some patients dreamed of Asclepius touching them with his staff, or of snakes, his sacred animal, slithering over their bodies. They would awaken healed, or at least believe they had received divine instructions on what to do next. Whether these dreams were real, psychosomatic, or placebo-driven, the effects were profound. Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, acknowledged the value of dreams in diagnosis. They didn't dismiss them as nonsense. In fact, they believed the body could reveal its state through symbolic visions. The dream of flowing water might suggest kidney issues. The dream of being crushed could point to a chest ailment. In Hippocratic texts, dreams were often classified as either natural or divine. Natural dreams were caused by diet, digestion, or emotional stress. Divine ones, a whole other category, direct messages from the gods or the cosmos. But not all dream interpreters wore white robes and carried scrolls. The oneirocratai, or dream readers, were the real stars of the public square. Using dream manuals, omens, and an enormous supply of interpretive flair, they translated dreams into warnings, blessings, or instructions. The most famous of these guides was the Oneirocritica, written by Artemidorus of Daldis in the 2nd century CE, a book still studied centuries later. In Greece, the dream wasn't just a nighttime experience, it was a bridge between mortal and divine, body and soul, illness and healing. And if you were lucky, you'd wake up with a cure, and maybe a snake curled at your feet. Throughout the ancient world, one category of dream carried more weight than all others: the prophetic dream. These weren't just messages, they were warnings, revelations, or calls to action. For cultures spanning Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and beyond, prophetic dreams were sacred transmissions from a higher plane, direct links to gods, fate, or the mysterious mechanisms of the cosmos. In the ancient Hebrew tradition, prophetic dreams were a recognized and respected channel of divine communication. The Old Testament is filled with examples. Think of Joseph, son of Jacob, who dreamt of sheaves of wheat bowing before his own, a symbol of his future rise to power. Later, as an interpreter of Pharaoh's dreams in Egypt, he predicted 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. That one dream, of cows, fat and thin, altered the course of Egypt's economy. Joseph didn't just read dreams, he became a national strategist by doing so. Likewise, in Mesopotamia, kings often received dreams that foretold victory, disaster, or divine favor. The Assyrian king Ashurbanipal claimed he saw the gods in his dreams, guiding him to success in war and governance. Prophetic dreams were seen as confirmation that a ruler had divine legitimacy, essential in a world where the line between king and deity was thin. The Greeks, too, recognized this prophetic potential. Dreams were categorized. Those from the subconscious were called enhypnia, but those that revealed truth were called oniroi alethinoi. These were not taken lightly. Before major decisions, founding a city, declaring war, launching a voyage, Greek leaders often consulted dreams, or those trained to interpret them. Dreams were so revered that they had their own minor deities, the oniroi, winged spirits who entered the sleeper's mind with messages from the gods. Even the Romans, typically more pragmatic, took prophetic dreams seriously. The Emperor Augustus was said to have dreamt of future glory, and even Nero consulted dream interpreters during his reign. Perhaps not enough, considering how that turned out. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, before defeating Hannibal, reportedly had a dream of victory sent by the spirits of his ancestors. In ancient societies, prophetic dreams weren't side notes. They were tools of power, instruments of policy, and evidence of divine selection. The fate of nations, the health of empires, and the rise of legends often began with something as simple as a whispered vision in the dark. While Greek Asclepian temples are the most famous, ancient dream incubation was not exclusive to Greece. In Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, dream healing thrived in a rich blend of Hittite, Phrygian, and later Greco-Roman traditions, with temples and sacred sites dedicated to facilitating contact with divine forces through sleep. The most fascinating example comes from the cult of Men, a Phrygian lunar god associated with healing, cycles, and, naturally, dreams. His temples often sat on hills, facing the night sky, as if positioned to catch lunar messages beamed down into the dreams of supplicants. People suffering from physical ailments, spiritual unrest, or uncertainty about their futures would come to these shrines to practice incubation. Ritual sleep with the hope of receiving a curative or guiding dream. The process was similar to what we saw in Asclepian practices, but Anatolian incubation had its own twists. Worshippers would sometimes walk labyrinth paths or sleep beneath celestial carvings, believing their proximity to sacred geometry would focus divine messages. Music, incense, and chant were often used to tune the sleeper's mind to the divine frequency. This wasn't sleep for rest, it was sleep as spiritual reception. Texts from the region also mention dream priests, spiritual specialists trained to guide and interpret these visions. Some would even seed dreams, suggesting imagery or symbols before sleep to shape the encounter. For example, someone wanting a vision of their future child might sleep with a carved fertility idol under their pillow. If they dreamt of a lion, the priest might declare that a brave son was on the way. If they dreamt of rain, a daughter, blessed by growth and wisdom. Hittite records also reference divine encounters in dreams, especially among royalty. Kings and queens received strategic advice, healing knowledge, and occasionally harsh warnings from the gods in their sleep. One dream reportedly instructed a queen to adopt a foreign goddess into her shrine, an early example of divine diplomacy. Dream incubation in Anatolia wasn't just personal, it was communal and cosmic. Pilgrims traveled long distances, often forming temporary healing communities, bound not by blood, but by shared vulnerability and hope. And through sleep, they believed the gods could reset the course of their lives. In Anatolia, to dream wasn't passive. It was an active ritual participation, where healing and prophecy flowed not from logic, but from the silent language of sleep. By the 2nd century CE, the ancient art of dream interpretation had matured into a disciplined craft, and one man took it upon himself to systematize it all, Artemidorus of Daldis. A Greek from Asia Minor, Artemidorus wrote the Honey-drenched, the most comprehensive and influential dream manual of the ancient world. And unlike mystical scribes who veiled everything in divine mystery, Artemidorus approached dreams with the methodical precision of a scholar and the curiosity of a streetwise psychologist. The Honey-drenched wasn't some mystical pamphlet. It was a 5-book tome, written in clear Greek, filled with thousands of dream scenarios and their meanings, culled from personal interviews, temple records, and public performances. Artemidorus claimed he spent decades collecting dream accounts from people of all walks of life: sailors, merchants, prostitutes, soldiers. His logic: if you want to understand the soul of a culture, listen to its dreams. He organized dreams into categories: actions, animals, professions, bodily functions, even types of relationships. Dreaming of flying, that could suggest freedom or arrogance. Dreaming of being naked in public, depending on your social class, it might mean shame or future power. Dreaming of teeth falling out, that meant a loss, usually of relatives. That one seems to have stuck through the centuries. But what makes Artemidorus unique is that he emphasized context. Unlike earlier dream books, which gave static meanings, Artemidorus stressed the importance of the dreamer's status, gender, occupation, and current life circumstances. A wealthy man dreaming of a shipwreck meant business troubles. A poor man dreaming of the same thing might find new fortune. Interpretation wasn't one-size-fits-all, it was tailored, almost like early psychotherapy. Artemidorus also tackled symbolism head-on. He understood that dreams used metaphor and irony. A dream of dying didn't mean death, it could mean renewal. A dream of sex didn't always refer to desire. It might signal dominance, power struggles, or guilt. His interpretations walk a strange line between deeply logical and incredibly bizarre. The Honey-drenched wasn't just a curiosity, it was used for centuries across the Roman Empire and Byzantine world. It influenced medieval dream interpreters and was translated into Arabic, keeping the flame alive long after classical temples fell. With Artemidorus, the dream became a text to be studied, decoded not just for prophecy, but for insight. He may not have believed dreams came from gods, but he certainly believed they came from somewhere deep, strange, and worth exploring. Not all dreams in the ancient world were gifts from the gods. Some were terrors from the depths, dark, haunting visions believed to come from restless spirits, demonic forces, or even the underworld itself. These weren't seen as mere bad nights of sleep. They were warnings, punishments, or omens of things to come. The Babylonians were among the first to differentiate dreams of divine origin from those that came from malevolent forces. If a dream caused fear, illness, or distress, it was considered polluted, and a priest would be called to perform apotropaic rituals, cleansing spells, offerings, or symbolic actions designed to neutralize the dream's effect. For example, if someone dreamed of being chased by a demon, the interpreter might recommend sleeping with a protective amulet under the pillow or burning cedarwood incense to ward off evil spirits. The Egyptians also had a well-developed idea of nightmare prevention. Certain dreams were believed to be caused by malicious entities, including the dead. Amulets bearing the Eye of Horus, or images of Bez, the dwarf god who protected households from dark forces, were worn to guard against these attacks. Some people even recited dream-erasing spells upon waking, treating the nightmare as a contagious curse that had to be spoken out of existence before it could manifest in the physical world. In Greek thought, nightmares often signified a message not from the Olympians, but from chthonic deities, gods of the earth and the underworld. Hades, Persephone, and even the terrifying Erinyes, Furies, could appear in dreams to express divine displeasure or signal a crime left unpunished. Dreamers who ignored these warnings did so at their peril. The philosopher Plato, in the Republic, even described the dream as a battleground between reason and appetite, where the lower parts of the soul ran wild. For him, the nightmare was not just a spiritual warning, but a psychological one, an indication that your inner self was out of balance. Even the Romans, practical as ever, feared dreams of certain animals, like owls, snakes, or wolves, as signs of impending death, betrayal, or war. They believed the dead could visit the living through dreams, sometimes to warn, sometimes to accuse. In every culture, nightmares were more than bad dreams. They were seen as cosmic red flags, reminders that the seen and unseen worlds were always connected, and that even in sleep, there was no true escape from fate. In the ancient world, dreams weren't just spiritual. They were political assets. Rulers, priests, generals, and prophets often weaponized dreams to justify decisions, sway public opinion, or consolidate authority. When the gods spoke in sleep, those in power were quick to say, "They spoke to me." Take Alexander the Great, for instance. Before he conquered Egypt, he reportedly dreamed of the god Ammon welcoming him as a son. Upon arrival at the Siwa oasis, the local oracle confirmed the dream, declaring Alexander a divine offspring. Was the dream real? Was it staged? It didn't matter. The message solidified his rule and painted him as more than mortal, a living god in the eyes of his troops and subjects. Dreams were especially useful during political transitions or uncertain times. In ancient Rome, Augustus claimed to have dreamed of a great victory at Actium, which he won against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Afterward, this dream was immortalized in literature and coins, turning it into a sacred narrative. Later emperors followed suit. If the gods supported your dream, who dared oppose your actions? Priests and oracles often played into this. Dream interpretation became a theological tool, especially when it aligned with the interests of a ruler or temple elite. Suppose a rebellious governor dreamt of disaster. The priest might interpret it as divine punishment for challenging imperial authority. On the flip side, dreams of fruitfulness and victory, interpreted correctly, could embolden leaders to begin campaigns, raise taxes, or enact reforms. This wasn't limited to men. Queen Hatshepsut of Egypt claimed in temple inscriptions that her birth was foretold in a dream by the god Amun, who appeared to her mother and prophesied divine rulership. By framing her reign as destined in dreams, she strengthened her legitimacy in a male-dominated throne. Prophets in the Hebrew Bible also used dreams to challenge kings. Daniel, for instance, interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream of a great statue, forecasting the rise and fall of empires. It wasn't just dream reading, it was geopolitics wrapped in allegory. In every civilization, dreams allowed leaders to say, "This is not just my will, it is the will of heaven." Whether divine revelation or calculated propaganda, dreams were a powerful currency, turning the subconscious into statecraft, one vision at a time. Though the ancient temples have crumbled and the priests of dream now sleep beneath layers of dust, the legacy of ancient dream interpretation lives on, whispering through time, science, and psychology. Much of what we believe today about dreams, our fascination with symbolism, recurring motifs, even nightmares, has roots in ancient frameworks that tried to make sense of the sleeping mind. The medieval world inherited these traditions wholesale. Islamic scholars translated the Oneirocritica of Artemidorus into Arabic, refining and expanding on it. In Islamic mysticism, Dreams became deeply respected as means of divine guidance. Meanwhile, Christian monks and theologians began cataloging dreams of saints and martyrs, visions that often predicted future miracles or divine justice. The same structure remained: sleep as a portal to the sacred, dreams as veiled messages, and interpreters as the bridge between human and divine. Fast forward to the 19th and 20th centuries, and we meet Sigmund Freud, who, despite rejecting religious interpretations, borrowed heavily from the symbolic structure pioneered millennia before. In The Interpretation of Dreams, 1899, Freud argued that dreams expressed repressed desires and fears, but he still used ancient tools: metaphor, symbol, narrative. His protege, Carl Jung, went further, describing the dream world as populated by archetypes, universal figures like the shadow, the hero, and the wise old man, eerily similar to figures one might find in a Greek temple or Babylonian omen list. Even modern neuroscience, while stripping dreams of their mysticism, still respects their complexity. REM sleep, lucid dreaming, and the influence of trauma or memory on dream content. These ideas echo ancient notions that dreams reflect both the health of the body and the state of the soul. Pop culture, too, carries on the torch. From film and literature to tarot and New Age spirituality, dreams remain a source of fascination. Whether it's a horror film based on sleep paralysis or a dream journal app promising self-discovery, the ancient idea still pulses beneath: that what we see in sleep matters. In the end, the ancients may not have had brain scans or sleep labs, but they understood something we still chase today. Dreams are not random. They are stories, signals, or shadows, whispered in the language of gods, ancestors, or ourselves. The question remains the same across time: what is your dream trying to tell you? In the mid-19th century, the United States was a country stretching at the seams. By 1860, California had been a state for a full decade, but it often felt more like a distant cousin than a sibling. The eastern half of the country buzzed with cities, telegraphs, and railroads, while the western frontier remained rugged, remote, and painfully disconnected. A letter from New York to San Francisco could take 3 to 4 weeks, sometimes longer if storms, delays, or bandits got in the way. And that's if it arrived at all. Mail routes at the time were as convoluted as they were inefficient. The most common path involved ships carrying mail down the Atlantic, across the Isthmus of Panama, then back up the Pacific coast. A journey filled with delays, tropical diseases, and logistical nightmares. Meanwhile, the overland route via stagecoach was slow, perilous, and frequently bogged down by muddy trails, snowbound passes, or attacks from outlaws and hostile terrain. This lag wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a political problem. The federal government worried that California, increasingly isolated, might drift away in spirit or loyalty. In an era where secession was already on the horizon, maintaining unity across the continent was not just ideal, it was urgent. Entrepreneurs and visionaries began floating bold solutions, none bolder than the idea of creating a central relay system using the one thing the American West had in abundance: open land and fast horses. If skilled riders could gallop across the country in shifts, swapping horses at stations every 10 to 15 miles, maybe, just maybe, they could cut delivery time from weeks to just 10 days. It was an insane proposal. The route would be nearly 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California. It would cross mountains, deserts, rivers, and territories that had barely been mapped. There would be extreme heat, freezing nights, and the ever-present danger of ambush. But if it worked, it would be the fastest communication line between East and West. The problem was clear. America was expanding faster than its infrastructure. And so, with a mix of desperation, ambition, and pure frontier daring, a solution galloped into history, one saddlebag at a time. The Pony Express was about to be born. The Pony Express didn't just materialize out of the dust. It was the brainchild of 3 ambitious businessmen from the freight and stagecoach firm Russell, Majors & Waddell. Based in Missouri, The trio, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, were already veterans in the overland shipping world. Their company was responsible for hauling freight and government supplies across the wild frontier. But in 1860, they set their sights on a far more radical goal: speeding up mail delivery to California in the shortest time possible. At the time, Russell in particular was feeling the pressure. His reputation was on the line due to financial scandals and failed ventures. He saw the Pony Express not just as a patriotic service, but as a personal redemption arc, a way to restore his name and gain favor with the government. If they could prove their relay system worked, they hoped to land a lucrative federal mail contract. Alexander Majors brought the logistics brain. A devout and meticulous planner, he demanded discipline from his employees, even requiring riders and station masters to swear oaths against drinking and cursing. He also developed a highly structured system for the express. Stations would be built every 10 to 15 miles, larger home stations every 75 to 100 miles, and the entire route would be maintained like a military operation. William B. Waddell, the quietest of the trio, provided the legal and financial backbone. While Russell was the salesman and Majors the operational genius, Waddell kept the books and ensured the company stayed afloat, at least for a while. Together, the three poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into the venture. They bought over 400 horses, hired more than 80 riders, and built roughly 190 stations across the most remote parts of the frontier. They knew it was a gamble, and they knew the route would be grueling. But they also knew that whoever solved the communication crisis would earn a permanent place in American history. And so, without any government funding, they launched the service themselves. It was a bold move, financially reckless, logistically insane, and yet deeply symbolic of American grit. In April of 1860, the Pony Express was ready to ride. The race against time and terrain was on. Creating the Pony Express route was like building a fragile bridge across a continent, with no safety net and almost no margin for error. The full distance spanned nearly 2,000 miles, stretching from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, through a dizzying array of landscapes: rolling plains, mountain ranges, high deserts, and dangerous river crossings. To make this insane idea work, the founders built a chain of approximately 190 relay stations, spaced every 10 to 15 miles, about the distance a horse could ride at full speed before tiring. Every 75 to 100 miles, a home station provided rest and shelter for the riders, where they could sleep, eat, and hand off the mail to a fresh rider. But the real backbone of the express was the horses, more than 400 in all. They were chosen not for looks or stature, but for sheer speed and stamina. In the east, fleet-footed thoroughbreds ruled the prairie. In the rugged west, compact and hardy Mustangs carried the mail across the mountains and desert. These were the Ferraris of the frontier. Riders would gallop at full speed, jump off mid-stride, and leap onto a fresh mount in a matter of seconds. Each station had to be manned, stocked, and secure. Some were little more than sod huts or wooden shacks. Others were fortified structures surrounded by barbed fencing and guarded by station keepers with rifles. Supplies, water, feed, and food had to be transported in advance. This meant months of preparation, and it all had to be done in some of the most remote, inhospitable land in America. Weather posed one of the biggest threats. Riders would endure snowstorms in the Sierra Nevada, sandstorms in the Utah desert, and brutal summer heat on the Nebraska plains. Wild animals, swollen rivers, and collapsing trails were daily hazards. And then there were human dangers: bandits, outlaws, and the rising tensions of conflict with Native American tribes. But despite the chaos, the system worked. With riders swapping every 75-100 miles, and fresh horses every 10-15, the mail flew across the continent in as little as 10 days, a revolutionary speed at the time. It was a logistical miracle stitched together by courage, sweat, and raw determination. In a land where miles meant isolation, the Pony Express stitched together a fragile thread of connection, one hoofbeat at a time. On April 3, 1860, the Pony Express made its historic debut. In St. Joseph, Missouri, a crowd gathered at the stables of the Pikes Peak Stables building, buzzing with excitement. The inaugural rider, most likely Johnny Fry, though records are somewhat disputed, mounted his horse, took the leather mochila, specially designed mail pouch, and dashed off westward at breakneck speed. The crowd cheered, cannons fired, and just like that, a new chapter in American history thundered to life. The mailbag Fry carried weighed around 20 pounds, filled with letters, newspapers, and telegrams bound for California. The telegraph message had already been wired from Washington, D.C., and would now travel the rest of the way on horseback, symbolizing the union of technology and raw human effort. At the same moment, a counterpart in Sacramento rode eastward, launching the bidirectional relay. Between them stood nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, 190 stations, and some of the harshest terrain North America had to offer. And they planned to cross it in just 10 days. Each rider on the route carried the mochila from one station to the next, leaping off a lathered horse and onto a fresh one in under 2 minutes. The mochila was ingeniously designed. It had 4 locked pouches and could be quickly slipped over the saddle horn without unstrapping anything. Speed was everything. Riders were expected to maintain a pace of 10 miles per hour, even in the dead of night through rain, snow, or hostile territory. Despite the chaos, the first ride succeeded. The mail from Missouri reached Sacramento in 9 days and 23 hours. A triumph. Newspapers hailed it as a miracle of modern communication, and the legend of the Pony Express was born almost overnight. Though only a few letters rode in that first mochila, the symbolic impact was immense. It wasn't just about getting mail from point A to B. It was about possibility, about proving that this wild, fractured continent could be connected, that man and horse could outpace isolation. For the riders, it was the beginning of a dangerous, thrilling chapter. For the nation, it was a taste of something new, instant communication, faster than anyone thought possible. The West had just gotten a little smaller. The lifeblood of the Pony Express wasn't the horses, the stations, or even the mochila. It was the riders, a band of young, wiry daredevils who defied weather, wilderness, and war to deliver the mail. They weren't just couriers. They were living legends in the making. The typical Pony Express rider was no older than 18, often closer to 16. They were light, usually under 125 pounds, so as not to weigh down the horses. Speed and endurance were everything. The now famous recruitment ads allegedly read, "Wanted, young, skinny, wiry fellows not over 18. Must be expert riders willing to risk death daily. Orphans preferred." While the wording is likely apocryphal, the spirit behind it was absolutely real. These young men rode 75 to 100 miles per shift, changing horses at every station but never resting until they'd passed the mochila to the next rider. They often rode at night, through torrential rain, snowstorms, or scorching heat. They carried revolvers and rifles, but against bandits or hostile attacks, their best defense was speed. Many of them traveled alone, unarmed, relying entirely on their ability to outrun trouble. Some riders became folk heroes. Pony Bob Haslam once rode 380 miles in under 2 days to deliver mail during a violent Paiute uprising, despite being wounded by arrows. William Buffalo Bill Cody, who would later become a Wild West showman, claimed to have ridden for the Express at age 15, though historians debate the accuracy of that tale. Regardless, the reality was already dramatic enough. Riders had to navigate the Rocky Mountains, cross the Great Basin Desert, and brave territories where the slightest mistake could mean freezing, drowning, or vanishing without a trace. And yet, the service maintained an astonishing reliability rate. Even in the harshest conditions, only one mochila was ever lost. Despite the danger, many riders loved the job. They were paid well for the time, $100 to $150 per month, a small fortune for a teenager. And they relished the thrill, the speed, and the sense of purpose. They weren't just riding mail, they were stitching the country together. The riders of the Pony Express were more than messengers. They were symbols of American courage, endurance, and tenacity, galloping through myth and memory with every hoofbeat. And for 18 unforgettable months, they proved that no frontier was too wide to cross. Riding for the Pony Express wasn't just a job. It was a daily gamble with death. The riders faced tension without it. Recipes for the dead, lists of beer offerings to the gods, and murals showing the brewing process all highlighted spiritual weight. But beer also fueled the labor economy. Workers who built the pyramids weren't slaves. They were paid laborers, and part of their daily rations included beer, sometimes up to 4 liters a day. This wasn't an indulgence. It was hydration, nutrition, and morale, all in one. One archaeologist even called it the ancient Egyptian energy drink. The state maintained strict control over production and distribution. Taxes were levied in beer, and its quality was regulated. Women, especially priestesses and temple workers, were often involved in brewing, reinforcing its connection to both domestic life and sacred power. In short, beer in Egypt wasn't a side note. It was central. It nourished the people, pleased the gods, and filled the tombs. And like the Nile itself, it flowed through every part of Egyptian life. Across ancient civilizations, beer wasn't just a drink, it was divine communion. Its frothy presence was invited into temples, funerals, and festivals. Fermentation was not seen as a chemical process, but as a mystical transformation, a gift from the gods that turned simple grain into sacred liquid. To brew beer was to interact with the spiritual world, and to drink it was to partake in something more than sustenance. In Suma, the goddess Ninkasi embodied this connection. Her hymn was both prayer and instruction, an act of devotion and a manual for sacred brewing. Rituals likely began with chants to invoke her presence before fermenting began. It's possible that the final beer was shared as part of temple offerings, given to priests and even poured out in libation to the gods themselves. In Egypt, the spiritual use of beer was woven even deeper into the religious fabric. Temples brewed their own beer for daily offerings, sometimes dedicating hundreds of jars at once. During the annual festival of drunkenness, worshippers celebrated the myth of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of destruction who was tricked into drinking beer dyed red to resemble blood. The result? Her bloodlust was sedated, and humanity was saved. It's a powerful tale of how beer was literally seen as a force that could tame divine wrath. Priests and priestesses played active roles in the brewing process, and many religious texts mention specific ritual brews intended for ceremonies. The presence of beer in funerary rites was also key. It was believed to sustain the soul on its journey to the afterlife. Some tomb inscriptions even list precise beer offerings alongside prayers and hymns. Outside the temples, seasonal festivals often involved large-scale communal drinking. These were not casual parties. They were acts of connection between the human and divine realms. Whether celebrating a harvest, honoring the dead, or marking a solstice, beer helped blur the line between the mundane and the mystical. Even in later cultures, like the Hebrews or the Hittites, beer retained spiritual undertones. While wine gained favor in elite rituals, beer remained tied to fertility, the earth, and the working class, maintaining its ancient role as a sacred and grounding force. In the ancient world, drinking beer wasn't just about thirst. It was about aligning yourself with cosmic rhythms, with gods, nature, and the cycle of life and death. Beer wasn't just a product of civilization, it may have been a cause of it. Some historians and archaeologists now argue that the desire to brew beer was one of the driving forces behind early agriculture and settlement. While grain was certainly grown for bread, the possibility that humans began cultivating cereals in part to make beer is gaining increasing scholarly support. If true, beer isn't just a byproduct of civilization, it's one of its founding pillars. In ancient Mesopotamia, where organized farming first took root, evidence suggests that barley, one of the earliest domesticated grains, was prized not just for food, but for its fermentable sugars. Once harvested, barley could be stored, ground, and used in both bread and beer production. And unlike water, which was often polluted, fermented beer was safe to drink and could be stored longer. This made it essential for early communities, especially in arid or semi-arid regions where water supplies were unreliable. Beer production also necessitated a level of social organization. Brewing required tools, storage vessels, controlled temperatures, and precise timing. This encouraged division of labor, technological innovation, and even early science. Clay tablets show that ancient brewers understood fermentation processes well enough to replicate them consistently. No small feat in an age without thermometers or yeast packets. In urban centers like Uruk and Babylon, breweries became part of state and temple economies. Rations of beer were distributed to workers, soldiers, and bureaucrats. Taxes could be levied in grain or beer, and because beer was tied to both the economy and religion, its production was closely monitored and regulated. This meant that brewing contributed to the rise of bureaucracy, record-keeping, and standardized weights and measures. Beer was also instrumental in the growth of trade networks. Regions with surplus grain and brewing knowledge exchanged beer, ingredients, and brewing tools with neighboring cultures. Pottery jars filled with fermented beverages have been found in Levantine and Egyptian trade sites, suggesting beer was a commodity worth transporting. In short, beer helped humans settle, organize, and thrive. It fueled workers, connected cities, supported rituals, and justified grain cultivation. The frothy beverage was far more than a treat. It was liquid infrastructure, building the foundation of the ancient world, sip by sip. Long before breweries were industrialized or recipes were written down, beer was the domain of women. In many ancient cultures, brewing was not a male-dominated profession, but a household art practiced almost exclusively by females. And far from being a humble kitchen chore, brewing was seen as a sacred and skilled craft, passed from mother to daughter like an heirloom recipe. In Sumerian society, beer was so entwined with femininity that even the goddess of brewing, Ninkasi, was female. This wasn't symbolic, it reflected the reality that Sumerian women were the principal brewers in both domestic and temple contexts. Brewing and baking were often done side by side, and in the early days, both involved fermentation. While men oversaw politics and trade, women made the food and drink that sustained the household and society. In Egypt, women continued to dominate brewing, especially in the home. Beer was brewed in clay vessels using lightly baked loaves of grain, water, and flavorings. The process was labor-intensive but routine. Many women brewed daily or weekly, not just for family consumption but for sale or trade in local markets. In wealthier households, female servants or workers managed small-scale breweries. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs often depict women brewing, straining, and storing beer, highlighting their central role in this key part of life. Women were also heavily involved in brewing for temples and rituals. Priestesses and temple workers often oversaw sacred batches meant for offerings or religious festivals. In some regions, being a brewer was a source of social status and spiritual influence. These women weren't just cooks. They were custodians of divine tradition. Over time, as societies grew more stratified and beer became commercialized, men began to dominate public brewing. But in the earliest chapters of beer's history, women held the reins. They developed the methods, managed the ingredients, and safeguarded the knowledge. Interestingly, echoes of this tradition survived into the medieval period. In Europe, many early brewers were alewives, women who made and sold ale from their homes. Some wore tall hats to be seen in the marketplace, a detail that would later be twisted into the stereotypical image of a witch. But in the ancient world, a woman with a brewpot wasn't suspicious. She was respected. She nourished gods and mortals alike, one bubbling jar at a time. Ancient brewing wasn't just luck and magic. It was a craft refined over generations, blending observation, experimentation, and environmental know-how. While each culture had its own variations, the core principles of brewing were surprisingly consistent: grain, water, fermentation, and time. But the specifics, that's where it gets fascinating. The primary grain used across much of the ancient world was barley, though emmer wheat was also common, especially in Egypt. These grains were chosen not only for their availability, but because they naturally contained the sugars and enzymes necessary for fermentation. Grains were usually partially malted, soaked in water, and allowed to germinate slightly, then either ground into mash or baked into loaves of bread specifically intended for brewing. In both Mesopotamian and Egyptian traditions, these bread loaves, often called bapir in Sumer, were crumbled into large ceramic vats filled with water. The mixture was stirred, sometimes boiled, and then left to ferment. Natural yeast from the air, or from the vessels themselves, triggered the fermentation process. No one knew what yeast was, but they knew it worked, and that certain vessels made better beer, likely because they housed residual yeast colonies. To sweeten or flavor the beer, brewers added dates, honey, herbs, or spices. Egyptian beer, in particular, was often thick and sweet, almost like a liquid porridge. Filtering was optional. Some versions were consumed with straws to avoid sediment. Others were so nutritious that beer was considered a meal in itself, especially for laborers and the poor. Temperature played a key role. In hot climates like Egypt and Mesopotamia, brewers timed their work carefully and used cool storage pits or shaded courtyards to control the environment. In some cases, beer was aged in sealed clay jars, while in others it was meant to be consumed fresh. Brewing tools included large clay vessels, wooden paddles, woven sieves, and sometimes stone hearths for heating. Everything was made by hand, and every batch was slightly different. But the knowledge was passed down orally or ritually, preserved through repetition, song, and prayer, like the hymn to Ninkasi. Far from primitive, ancient brewing techniques were sophisticated adaptations to local climates, grains, and cultural preferences. They reflect not just culinary skill, but an intimate relationship with nature, time, and transformation, a kind of alchemy where grain and water became a sacred social elixir. As beer became central to daily life, its role expanded far beyond the household or temple. In many ancient civilizations, beer was not just a beverage, it was currency, commodity, and economic engine. From workers' wages to state taxes, beer was woven directly into the fabric of ancient commerce. In Mesopotamia, beer was a key component of the ration system. Workers, including builders, farmers, and even scribes, received daily portions of beer as part of their standard pay. The amount and quality varied by rank. Higher officials received more refined beer, while laborers got thicker, coarser varieties. Detailed cuneiform tablets list these allocations, and thousands of ancient receipts show beer transactions, proof that it was as important as silver or grain in the economic ecosystem. Beer production itself became a professional trade. Breweries, often attached to temples or estates, required a small army of laborers, grain collectors, millers, bakers, fermenters, and transporters. Some regions specialized in beer production, creating regional styles and establishing localized trade routes. These beers weren't bottled and shipped as today, but they could be moved in ceramic jars sealed with wax or cloth. Traders bartered beer for other goods like wool, pottery, and olive oil. In Egypt, the picture was similar. Beer was produced on an enormous scale in both urban centers and rural estates. Breweries were often attached to state granaries, and their output supported workers, soldiers, and temple activities. Beer was taxed, tracked, and stockpiled like any strategic resource. In hard times, beer even became a bartering tool in place of scarce currency. Beer also played a role in long-distance trade. Clay vessels with residues of barley-based brews have been found as far apart as the Levant, Cyprus, and Nubia, suggesting that fermented beverages were exchanged alongside luxury items. While wine would eventually dominate elite markets, beer remained the people's drink, embedded in every transaction from village markets to temple distributions. Its portability and perishability made beer a uniquely local economic product, but one with national importance. Its production supported farmers, artisans, merchants, and priests alike. It was both daily sustenance and state infrastructure. In short, ancient beer wasn't just consumed. It was counted, traded, stored, and spent. It helped build pyramids, fund temples, and a gauntlet of perils that would have made most grown men turn back. And yet, these mostly teenage boys pressed forward, through nature's wrath, armed enemies, and a land that often seemed determined to swallow them whole. One of the most persistent threats came from the environment itself. Riders braved blizzards in the Sierra Nevada, blistering heat across the Nevada desert, and sudden thunderstorms that could flood river crossings or turn dirt paths into impassable muck. Slipping off a horse in freezing conditions could mean hypothermia. One wrong move in a swollen river could end in drowning, and many came dangerously close. Then there were the animals. Packs of wolves sometimes chased riders at night. Rattlesnakes coiled in trail-side brush, and mountain lions stalked the high passes. But even more dangerous than wildlife were the bandits and bushwhackers who knew that a rider's mochila contained valuable letters, some even laced with gold dust or money orders. Though the riders carried revolvers, they were outnumbered, and stopping meant risking both life and mission. Tensions with Native American tribes also boiled over during the Pony Express's brief existence. The Paiute War in 1860, sparked by grievances over land, broken promises, and settler encroachment, led to several attacks on Pony Express stations. Riders were ambushed, station keepers were killed, and multiple stations were burned to the ground. The most famous episode occurred when Pony Bob Haslam galloped nearly 190 miles through hostile territory to carry the mail, suffering wounds from arrows, but completing his route regardless. Even isolation was a danger. Riders were alone, often for hours, with nothing but their horse, their weapon, and the looming dark. A broken leg, an injured horse, or a missed station could mean dying alone in the wilderness, never found. And yet, they rode. Despite all this, the system endured. Mail was delayed, but rarely lost. Riders were occasionally wounded, but they almost always made it through. In 18 months of operation, only a handful of men were killed on the job. The Pony Express wasn't a fantasy of the Wild West. It was a brutal, often terrifying reality. But in surviving these dangers, the riders became legends, proving that even the most unforgiving terrain could be tamed, if only for long enough to deliver the mail. Though the Pony Express only operated for 18 months, its impact on the United States was swift, far-reaching, and undeniably profound. In a country teetering on the edge of civil war, and desperate to feel unified across its vast landscape, the Express proved one thing loud and clear: distance was no longer destiny. Before the Pony Express, it took weeks for letters to travel from the East Coast to California. Important political decisions, commercial deals, and personal news often arrived too late to matter. But with the Express, mail could reach San Francisco in just 10 days. Suddenly, Californians were no longer out of sync with the rest of the country. Businesses grew bolder. Newspapers could report near real-time updates from across the nation. Families felt closer. And most importantly, the Union felt more connected, which would become critical as the Civil War loomed. Politically, the Express also reassured the federal government that the West was within reach. It symbolized national strength and cohesion at a time when fragmentation felt dangerously close. President James Buchanan received regular updates from California during the tense months leading up to Lincoln's election, in part thanks to the Express. Economically, it helped lay the groundwork for transcontinental infrastructure. The stations built across remote territory became future sites for railroads, telegraph lines, and stagecoach routes. Many Pony Express routes would later be absorbed into more permanent communication systems. What was once a bold gamble became the blueprint for how America would connect itself coast to coast. And culturally, the Pony Express became the embodiment of frontier spirit. Newspapers romanticized the riders, creating instant heroes. Young men across the country dreamed of taking the reins, galloping through danger with a saddlebag full of destiny. The Express became mythologized, even as it operated, capturing the imagination of a country hungry for symbols of courage and unity. Even after it ended, the Pony Express continued to shape American identity. It represented speed, courage, sacrifice, and above all, possibility. In just over a year, it managed to do what steamships, Congress, and diplomacy had failed to do: make a fractured, sprawling nation feel like one. The Pony Express didn't just deliver mail, it delivered the future, one gallop at a time. For all its daring and triumph, the Pony Express was doomed from the start. It wasn't a matter of failure, it was a matter of technology. As fast as a horse could ride, nothing could compete with the speed of a wire. Just 2 days after the Pony Express officially launched in April 1860, construction began on the transcontinental telegraph, a coast-to-coast communication system that would transmit messages in minutes rather than days. The telegraph poles and lines advanced steadily westward from the Missouri River and eastward from California. Every mile of wire spelled another nail in the coffin of the Express. By October 24, 1861, just 18 months after the first ride, the final telegraph wire was strung across the country. The system went live, and the connection was instantaneous. That very same day, the Pony Express carried its last letter. The silence of hoofbeats was replaced by the rhythmic click of Morse code. But even before the telegraph, the Pony Express was bleeding money. Despite its legendary performance, it was a commercial disaster. Russell, Majors, and Waddell had poured more than $700,000 into the operation and barely recouped a fraction. With no federal subsidy and high operational costs, horses, riders, station upkeep, and supply logistics, the Express was never a sustainable business model. It was built as a proof of concept, a bold advertisement for a mail contract that never fully came through. Russell himself faced financial scandal, and the company began to collapse. By the time the telegraph was completed, the Express was already on its last legs, heroic, beloved, but completely obsolete. Yet the end came with little bitterness. The very goal the Pony Express set out to prove, that rapid coast-to-coast communication was possible, had been achieved. Riders turned to other frontier jobs, stations were repurposed or abandoned, and the nation turned its eyes to the future. The fall of the Pony Express was not a failure, it was a passing of the torch. The horse gave way to the wire, just as the wire would later yield to radio, satellites, and the internet. But for one brief, shining moment, America watched in awe as teenage boys and powerful horses conquered time and distance. In a world obsessed with speed, the Pony Express galloped into legend and left hoofprints no telegraph wire could ever erase. Though it lasted only 18 months, the Pony Express galloped straight into the mythology of the American West, becoming one of the most enduring and romanticized stories in the nation's history. In reality, it was a risky, short-lived business venture. But in the public imagination, it became something far greater, a symbol of heroism, speed, and the relentless frontier spirit. Hollywood, dime novels, and school textbooks transformed the Express into legend. The image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sunset, thundering across the prairie with a leather mail pouch and a six-shooter at his side, captured the nation's heart. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was national identity in motion. At a time when America was still defining itself, the Pony Express offered a story of bravery, sacrifice, and unity through hardship. Figures like Pony Bob Haslam and Buffalo Bill Cody became frontier celebrities. Cody, whether he rode for the Express or not, capitalized on the legend in his Wild West shows, cementing the image of the fearless teenage career in the minds of millions across the world. The Express became shorthand for grit, daring, and everything Americans wanted to believe about their pioneer past. Monuments soon followed. Statues of galloping riders now stand in cities across the old trail, from St. Joseph to Sacramento. Highways and bike paths trace the original route. Reenactments, museum exhibits, and historical tours keep the memory alive. Even the U.S. Postal Service has issued Pony Express stamps, honoring the brief but bold endeavor that helped unite the nation. But the story endures for a deeper reason. The Pony Express reminds us of a moment in history when human endurance raced neck and neck with nature's obstacles. When communication meant risk and connection required courage. It tells us that speed once came not from satellites, but from sheer determination and a willingness to ride through snow, desert, and darkness with nothing but a horse and a dream. In our age of instant messages and global networks, it's easy to forget just how hard-won communication once was. The Pony Express stands as a tribute to those who bridged impossible distances, not with fiber optics or electricity, but with muscle, grit, and a pounding heartbeat. Its legend remains not because it lasted, but because, for a brief and shining moment, it outran the impossible. The earliest known beer didn't come in a frosty mug or a labeled bottle. It came in a clay pot in the middle of a Sumerian village thousands of years ago. Long before Rome rose or pyramids stood, the people of ancient Mesopotamia, specifically the Sumerians, were brewing beer in ways both simple and sacred. And they weren't just drinking it, they were worshipping it. Beer, in Sumerian society, wasn't just a casual beverage. It was a staple food, a form of currency, a religious offering, and a symbol of civilization. It's no accident that the oldest written recipe in human history is not for bread or soup, but for beer. Found on clay tablets dating back to around 1800 BCE, the hymn to Ninkasi praises the goddess of beer, while simultaneously laying out brewing instructions in verse. Ninkasi wasn't a minor deity, she was revered. To brew beer was to invoke her presence. The brewing process was both practical and poetic. Sumerians would bake a special bread called bapir, made of barley, and often mixed with honey or dates. This bread was then crumbled into jars of water and left to ferment naturally. The result wasn't anything like modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, more like a nutritious gruel, and it was essential to daily life. Water in the ancient world was often contaminated, but beer, thanks to its fermentation process, was safer. It was rich in calories and nutrients, and it became a vital part of the diet for laborers, priests, and royalty alike. Workers on temple projects or irrigation ditches were frequently paid in beer rations, which could amount to several liters a day. Socially, beer was a communal experience. Rather than drinking from mugs, people often gathered around large ceramic vessels and drank through long reed straws, filtering out the sediment. It wasn't just about getting drunk, it was about bonding, surviving, and even honoring the gods. In many ways, beer helped define what it meant to be Sumerian. It was embedded in rituals, law codes, agriculture, and economics. It was liquid civilization, both a daily necessity and a sacred act. And it set the stage for brewing cultures across the ancient world, from the banks of the Tigris to the shores of the Nile. If the Sumerians gave beer its spiritual beginning, the Egyptians industrialized it. By the time the Old Kingdom was rising along the Nile, beer had become more than a sacred drink. It was a pillar of Egyptian society, woven into everything from daily meals to divine offerings and funeral rites. Egyptian beer was brewed on a scale that dwarfed earlier methods. At large temples and palace complexes, massive breweries operated as part of the state economy. In fact, beer production was often overseen by religious institutions. The Egyptians believed beer was a gift from Osiris, god of agriculture and fertility, and it featured prominently in ceremonies honoring deities such as Hathor, the goddess of music, fertility, and joy, frequently associated with intoxication and revelry. The brewing process was similar to that of the Sumerians, but had evolved in both technique and scale. Bread made from emmer wheat or barley was partially baked, crumbled into large vats, and mixed with water. Dates or honey were added for sweetness, and the mixture was left to ferment in ceramic jars. The resulting beverage was thick, unfiltered, and highly nutritious. sometimes consumed with a spoon rather than sipped. Beer wasn't just for the living. Tombs were stocked with jars of beer for the afterlife, alongside loaves of bread and meat. Beer was considered so essential that no respectable journey to the next world could be imagined to sustain empires. A mug of beer may have cost a few copper coins, but behind it stood a microcosm of civilization. In the ancient world, beer was the great equalizer. Everyone drank it, but not everyone drank the same kind. Just as with food, clothing, and language, beer reflected and reinforced the rigid social hierarchies of the time. While commoners sipped thick, hearty brews for survival, the elites turned beer into a status symbol, a ritual offering, and sometimes even a political tool. Among the Sumerians and Akkadians, workers were issued daily beer rations. Their brews were dark, unfiltered, and dense, more stew than drink, but incredibly nourishing. These were functional beers, meant to sustain laborers in hot, arid conditions. Yet even here, there was variation. Some tablets mention at least 9 distinct types of beer, ranked by quality and purpose. The better versions were often reserved for scribes, priests, or administrators, showing that beer was already being used to draw class lines. In Egypt, the contrast was even starker. While everyday Egyptians drank a thick beer made from emmer wheat and flavored with dates, the wealthy enjoyed refined brews, lighter, sweeter, and sometimes filtered. Tomb paintings depict nobles with goblets of golden beer, seated under palm fronds while servants poured from elegant jars. For the upper classes, beer was not just sustenance, it was an aesthetic experience. Pharaohs and their families received beer offerings daily, often alongside wine and bread. These libations weren't mere tradition. They reflected power. Only the rich could afford dedicated brewing staff, access to the finest ingredients, and the leisure to enjoy beer recreationally, rather than depend on it for calories. Beer also served diplomatic and ceremonial functions. During feasts, treaties, or religious festivals, offering beer of high quality signaled wealth and respect. Not offering beer, that could be seen as an insult. Interestingly, the brewing profession itself mirrored this divide. In homes and villages, women or slaves typically brewed the family's supply. But in temples or elite households, professional brewers, sometimes trained and salaried, handled production. The beer that flowed from temple vats was better regulated, better taxed, and more politically significant. So while beer was universal, its taste, texture, and meaning varied wildly depending on who you were. For some, it was daily fuel. For others, it was an expression of divinity, wealth, and refinement. In every jar, ancient beer carried not just flavor, but a quiet signature of social status, foaming at the rim. Though thousands of years have passed since Sumerian priestesses chanted to Ninkarsi or Egyptian workers sipped beer beneath pyramid shadows, the legacy of ancient brewing still lives on, in our recipes, rituals, economies, and cultural memory. Beer, perhaps more than any other beverage, connects us to the earliest expressions of civilization. Modern brewing owes a great debt to the ancient world. Many techniques we take for granted today, malting grain, fermenting with wild yeast, flavoring with herbs or fruit, were pioneered by brewers with no microscopes or thermometers. Instead, they relied on intuition, tradition, and trial and error, guided by oral wisdom and spiritual reverence. These methods formed the foundation of what would eventually become scientific brewing in later eras. The ancient attitude toward beer also lingers in cultural traditions. In places like Ethiopia, Peru, and rural Eastern Europe, communities still brew beer in ceramic vessels, often using age-old recipes passed down through families. Echoes of Sumerian and Egyptian kitchens. In these places, brewing is not just a hobby or business. It's a ritual of community, just as it was 5,000 years ago. The symbolic power of beer has also endured. Festivals, holidays, and social gatherings around the world still feature beer as a central offering, a drink of celebration, bonding, and identity. Even the communal pint at the pub carries the same spirit as the ancient Sumerian clay pots shared by reed straws. Beer as a bridge between people. Academically, the study of ancient brewing has sparked a growing field known as bioarchaeology. Using residue analysis, scientists have reconstructed ancient beer recipes, brewed them, and even sold them commercially. Experimental archaeology projects have successfully brewed beer from ancient Egyptian tomb recipes, offering modern people a literal taste of history. Perhaps most importantly, ancient beer reminds us that civilization wasn't just built on conquest, stone, or steel. It was also built in kitchens and breweries by ordinary people who turned grain and water into sustenance, economy, and culture. It was made by women, consumed by workers, and offered to gods. So the next time you raise a glass, remember, you're not just drinking a beverage, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and most universal rituals, a legacy brewed over millennia and still fermenting in every corner of the world.